I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. Today I'm happy to be speaking with Frederik Byrn Køhlert about his book, Serial Selves, Identity and Representation in Autobiographical Comics. Køhlert is lecturer in comic studies and American studies at the University of East Anglia in the UK. He is also the author of The Chicago Literary Experience, Writing the City, 1893 to 1953. In addition to being a course director for the new Master of Arts program in Comic Studies at his university, which is launching in September 2020, he is also the series editor for Routledge Focus on Gender, Sexuality, and Comic Studies, which is how I met him. He's actually one of the people encouraging and allowing me to explore a sort of obsession, some might call it, with Batman as part of that series, so I'm very grateful for that. His book Serial Selves explores just what comics as a medium offers for those writing about themselves, specifically marginalized groups who can play with certain stereotypes and move in and out of certain assumptions that isn't possible, or at least it's not possible in the same kind of way in literary writing or in film, for example. Very happy to have you on the show, Frederik. Thank you again. Let's start off with the question of how comics allow writers to explore things about themselves through autobiographical writing that they wouldn't be able to do necessarily in other media. What makes comics so special for this?
Well, that's a really good question, and kind of the central question that my book even asks, right? It's what is it about the form attracts people to write autobiographies in it? So the way I came about this project was that I hadn't really read comics in a lot of years. I grew up reading comics, and I grew up in Denmark, so I grew up reading all the sort of Franco-Belgian comics, so Tintin, or Asterix, or Lucky Luke, or all those things, and like Smurf comics, and all this kind of very in the French tradition that no one really outside of Europe seems to be very familiar with, right? So on the other hand, I didn't grow up reading any superhero comics. It wasn't really a thing at all in Denmark. So I don't think I knew that like Superman was a comic book character until I was like 10 years old or something. Like I knew about the movies and I knew about those things, but I don't think I fully realized that he's just like Donald Duck, in my Donald Duck comics or whatever. So I grew up reading this kind of thing and then stopped reading comics, when I started reading whatever other books and in high school and university and so on. And then it was only when I did my master's at the University of Oregon that I took a graduate seminar on comics and sort of like graphic novel type stuff that I realized that there was a whole other tradition there that was not superheroes and that was not whatever Smurf comics. And, we read Art Spiegelman's Mouse and we read Alton Bechdell's Fun Home and we read sort of these like very celebrated memoirs in comics form. And it just sort of occurred to me, and I don't think that seminar was centered around autobiography or anything like that. It was just like, here are some, cool, sort of sophisticated type graphic novels and let's read those. It occurred to me about all these books that we're reading, or most of them are autobiographies and memoirs, and a lot of the people writing them are people on the margins of the culture in some way, right? So whether that's in terms of sexuality or race or just by the fact that they're female authors writing in this form that's so associated with sort of, I guess, boys and men in general. So I started wondering, like, what is it that is attracting people to this form, right? What is the kind of like the promise that the form holds for authors who seem to want to tell their life stories in this like very sort of idiosyncratic form, right? Like there's something about being able to sit down and draw it, and in addition to writing it, that seems to be of central importance to these people. So what I've sort of set out to try to answer is, right, like what is it specifically formally about comics, right? So it's one thing to just say, well, comics, you get to whatever, draw yourself and so on. But I wanted to investigate the very specific formal properties of the form that allows authors to investigate both sort of their own relationship with themselves, but also relationships with the culture at large and their place in the culture. So the way I usually like to explain it is that, well, obviously, if you're writing literary autobiography, the convention is that you're representing yourself with the letter I. right? So that's this sort of weird abstraction that we've agreed on, that's how you represent yourself, right? So you write the letter I, and that I is sort of like unchanging throughout the narrative, and the reader can fill in that I based on, knowledge that you have about the person in real life or what the description in the book and so on. But obviously in comics, like, you get to do something very different, right? That I becomes like a concretized drawing on the page. And I thought that was the idea that started me on this project. Like, what happens when you get to draw that, and then you get to draw that serially again and again and again and again throughout a narrative. And what kind of opportunities does that open up for you as an autobiographical author? And then sort of the second thought, that there are more than two thoughts in this book, I promise. But the second step to sort of figuring that out was to start thinking about, well, the visual is a promise, but it's also perhaps a danger. In literary autobiography, where you represent yourself with an I, you get to abstract the self into this letter I, right? So, but in comics, you don't get to do that. You create this representation, but that representation is also maybe informed by other visual traditions, or it's in danger of slipping into other perhaps noxious visual traditions, such as racial stereotype or caricature or that kind of thing. So my book sort of proceeds from this idea that authors working in the form are always negotiating that border, right? So they're insisting on visuality, but they're also aware, or at least the authors I discuss are aware, that they are engaging with this like longer visual tradition that has some perhaps, like we could say, like uneasy slippages into stereotyping and caricature, and a broader visual tradition that is, maybe not what you're aiming for when you're telling your own story. But then the flip side of that in turn is that you get to maybe engage with that, and you get to play around with that, and you get to appropriate that, and you get to turn it on its head, or you get to parody it, or you get to at least like engage with that visual tradition. So that's a very long answer, but I think the shorter version of that is that there is, you get to draw yourself, you get to engage with a visual representation of yourself, which for marginalized authors can be an occasion for increased subjectivity, or for sort of inserting yourself into the culture. But then you also get to play around with your own representation, and perhaps subvert some expectations of what your readers or what your audience expect that representation to be.
Let's maybe talk a little bit more in detail about the way that, at least you argue in the book, that marginalized authors in particular have resources available to them through the comics form that makes it particularly appealing. Like you said, there's a history of racist, of homophobic sketches in cartoons and caricatures. And so it might seem that this is the worst place for anyone on the margins to be representing themselves, but it may not be. It may actually be an ideal place in some cases. Why is that? Why did you choose to focus in on sort of marginalized representations of people, and what does the comics form give them?
Well, exactly as you say, as soon as you engage with visual representation, you are in danger of, I think, appropriating some of those, or appropriating maybe the wrong word, but like you're in danger of coming close to certain visual codes that have been used to exclude or otherwise marginalize, right? But the main sort of theoretical framework that I set up in the book in terms of how comics are able to avoid, play around with, negotiate that relationship is because of the sort of essential instability of comics, right? So that's a lot of different techniques that I discuss throughout the book that authors have available to them, including, just like sort of the basic idea of seriality, right? Like you get to draw yourself again and again, and you can insist that you look, differently throughout the narrative. That's something that comes up in several of the chapters, and perhaps most noticeably in my chapter on Ariel Sragg's high school comics, which I guess they require maybe a little bit of introduction for people who are not familiar with them. But Ariel Sragg is an American comics artist who produced 4 volumes of comics, I guess memoirs about her 4 years in high school. So she ended up producing 1 volume for each of her years. The really interesting thing about them is that she drew them, or she wrote them, and then they were mostly drawn during the summer after each of the years that they chronicle. So it's like this really sort of rare example of an autobiography that's actually like made like only a few months after the events that it chronicles. So it's very contemporary. The written work or the drawn work is very contemporary with the events. And it also means that she has no foresight. It means that she's very in the throes of what is happening right at any moment, right? So she doesn't, in the first volume, know that she's eventually going to come out as gay. She doesn't know that, she'll spend most of her junior year depressed because she has this complicated relationship with her girlfriend. And so it's very sort of in the moment. But her style also develops, right? So there is this over, I think maybe 800 pages of comics. There's this constant development of how she represents herself, right? So the form becomes this experiment for her in creating herself and creating a life for herself and creating perhaps a more idealized life or a less idealized life, or to just sort of just experiment with visual codes and, what would I look like if I went full gay or those kinds of things, right? So she has panels where she's sort of experimenting with those types of stereotypes. But she also uses the form in all kinds of other ways. She uses different kinds of drawing style to represent different ways of remembering. So if she's remembering something based on just her memories, she might draw it in one style. But if she's remembering, or if she's drawing something based on notes from her diary, she'll draw it in a different style. So again, there are just different drawing styles available to her. And combined with essential formal properties of comics, whether that's page layout or sort of ideas of the gutter, as theorized by Scott McCloud, the idea that the gutter between panels, the white space, is where the reader fills in the blanks and sort of comes up with the connecting tissue that creates a narrative. So one of the things I'm arguing is that that's where the artists can manipulate that, right? They can use that to their own advantage and sort of insist on maybe an unstable reading experience or something that doesn't conform to expectations. So I think the short answer to your question, I end up with very long answers here.
That's all right.
Is that just the comics page has this surfeit of codes that you can play around with as an artist, right? If you think about literary prose, literary autobiography, or has a lot of tools available to it as well, of course, but the added dimension of the visual and the interplay between the visual and the verbal is really something that, especially these artists that I am talking about, are really taking advantage of and experimenting with. And they're chosen as examples of someone who really are, they're experimenting with the style, with the formal properties, with the ability of comics to act as sort of this facilitator for the construction of a self or multiple selves or serial selves, I guess.
Yeah.
Or whatever that may be.
I mean, in terms of the genre of autobiography or life writing, you brought up questions that I guess seem to be maybe standard in a sense for people studying that, but for myself and others who don't really study that or haven't read the literature, I found it really interesting that there are these sort of similar but different things that you and others have unpacked, like, for instance, the difference between an autobiography versus a diary versus a journal, in this case maybe versus portraiture or a self-portrait when we're dealing with art. I think there's always a temptation, sort of like Marshall McLuhan always said, of seeing one medium but using it as the older medium and not really realizing what it's capable of until a little while. Maybe you could say a little bit about what is the difference between a diary, which is interesting in the example of the high school student who seems to be keeping a diary but then writes a comic, which is not a diary because, among other things, it's meant to be seen. But there's all these sort of various ways of conceptualizing what it is you're talking about, what it is these people are doing, right? So how do you sort of distinguish between autobiography, diary, journal, self-portrait, these kinds of things?
Well, so there are a lot of different, as the one you did mention was also memoir, which is a genre. So the general term or the main category for this kind of writing is life writing, right? So that's sort of appeared as the catch-all for all these different genres. And that encompasses, anything that you can really imagine in terms of people writing about their lives. But there are obviously a lot of subgenres within that broader category, whether that's autobiography or memoir or the diary and so on. I think in some cases those differences are important, and in other cases it's not that important. Autobiographies are written by, in classic tradition, are written by very important men who sort of look back and reflect on their lives and their accomplishments and they're often sort of about the formation of the character. How do they come to be these kinds of important figures, right? And and that's been challenged, or that view has obviously been challenged by feminist critics who have sort of seen that as a very exclusionary way of looking at life writing, right? Because there is just a whole other body of memoirs written by women, or I guess autobiographies written by women that don't have that same kind of approach, right? But that are equally valuable, even though memoirs tend to focus on on sort of shorter periods, or, tend to focus on specific themes to do with one's life, right? They don't try to encapsulate like the whole of a life in that way. Mm-hmm. So most of the books or most of the comics that I talk about are, I would say, probably fall in the memoir category. But some of them are also specifically based on diaries, which is then a whole other category that are often sort of the basis for other kinds of life writing, right? So behind memoir and autobiography, there's often someone who's keeping a diary for a long time and uses that as the material. In my chapter on the artist Phoebe Gloeckner, you see that explicitly, right? So she's most well known for two books, Child's Life and The Diary of a Teenage Girl. The last one of those was turned into a movie a few years ago. She used to keep a lot of diaries as a child, and she's using these diaries as the raw material for her books. And even in one of her books, that's sort of this, like, it's I guess, text comics illustration hybrid, The Diary of a Teenage Girl, where she's using elements from her teenage diary verbatim and sort of rearranging it and turning it into more of a story. But elements of that original diary still appear in the published book, as does like drawings she did at the time of writing those diary entries. So there's also like almost like a nested relationship, right, between these different forms of writing, that one informs the other, and I think it's hard to make any kind of maintain like hard distinctions between those, because then you also have things like, in my first chapter I talk about the comics of French-Canadian artist Julie Doucet. Those are more dream logic infused, fantastic stories of giving birth to cats and so on. so there's not really like a one-to-one relationship with the real author or her real experiences in her comics. So more of an emotional autobiography or emotional memoir, something like that, of her inner interior life and her dreams and fears and desires and anxieties and so on. I don't think that distinction sort of between the different genres is something that is very important, but it is something that I try to at least be aware of when I look at this, because there are, of course, differences, especially in terms of who these works are originally for, how they're originally created, right? If you're creating a diary, one of the things about that is that you're not creating that with any knowledge of the next day, right? So that's sort of similar to the Ariel Track comics that I talked about just before, in that they are diary comics, except that they're kind of not, but there's sort of this weird in-between thing where she is making these comics without knowing anything about the future, but also knowing that she's going to keep creating more comics about the same, about her life. So there's this immediacy to it. In terms of that, I think it's important to keep in mind that they are diaries, and it's something that helps inform my analysis of those comics for sure.
Yeah, I like how she had a file called Truth in her illustration that she seems to refer to. It's interesting that all of these, and I'm sure many others, seem to rely on that sort of authentic voice. And I mean, that's a whole thing that we could talk about forever, and we probably don't want to, about authenticity and, what's more authentic. But it is interesting, as you say, like some that have been more constructed, looking back over their lives, perhaps come across as less authentic than like sort of in the moment, this happened to me this week. There are variations, I guess, of what feels more realistic or authentic. But, I mean, one illustration that I thought was really powerful was Phoebe Gloeckner. Is it Gloeckner?
Gloeckner. Yeah.
Her illustration of, I forget the exact person it was. I think it was her mother's boyfriend, right? So she has a sexual relationship with her mother's boyfriend at a really young age. Writing about that just struck me because there are some famous autobiographies of sexual abuse and these kinds of things that have been really powerful. But seeing an image of the act, I mean, you sort of talk about this in the book, but maybe you could say a little bit, because that to me illustrates a big difference between, say, writing about sexual abuse and illustrating it. I mean, I guess you could do it in a more abstract way, but, she draws erect penis of this guy is in the center of the image, and then she has these giant eyes that you couldn't do in a realistic photo, but it illustrates how sort of young she is. That, I mean, it just struck me as very different, and sort of the choices you might have to make are quite different than if you were writing about it. Maybe you can say a little bit about why that seems so striking, those kinds of images.
Yeah, I mean, I think the really short answer to that is because we are not used to seeing that, right? Like there's something about, we know that kind of abuse takes place and that it's fairly commonplace, but we also don't ever see it, right? And we can't see it because well, there's no documentation of it, but also artists can't really show it to us without creating, I guess, what would essentially be like child pornography, right? So there's this sort of weird thing that comics can do, where they can just like go in there and show us, reality and scare quotes, the reality of what that situation looks like in very direct terms. And I think that is something that Gleckner does to really powerful effect. Like, she pulls no punches, right? Just from if you
I'm sure people can Google this if they're interested.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, people pick up my book.
That's the better option. Pick up the book.
Well, no, but I mean, so people are, I'm whatever. It's at a table at a conference at a book fair or something, and I see people picking it up, and they sort of, they just like leaf through it, and they have to like shocked because they don't really expect. Well, here's a picture of childhood sexual abuse right there, right? With, as you say, like an erect penis, like pointed at a young girl, right? And it has that power to shock. And there's just something like comics can get away with doing that without crossing any sort of real, I guess, like, legal lines. Although Gleckner's work has been subject to censorship and has been removed from public libraries and that kind of thing. Well, because often comics will just be, well, it's a comic book, so let's put it in the children's section, right? So it ends up in children's sections at libraries, and it's called A Child's Life. It sounds very innocent, and then, well, children pick it up, and all kinds of trouble come out of that. Well, anyway, just back to the idea of being able to show that, and that's something. For example, so they made a movie out of this book, Diary of a Teenage Girl. And, there's no way, like, they're very true to the spirit of the book, but there's no way that they can do that, right? Even if the actress playing her 13, 14-year-old self, even if that actress is of age, and I believe that the actress was, but there's no way that they could really get away with showing that kind of scene, right? That would just be, well, it would be, bad taste, but also just like simply too controversial, right? So, but in comics, that's not really an issue, and that's still, well, it is an issue for some people, I suppose, but it's not really much of an issue in terms of representation.
Yeah.
So I think artists are drawn to the form for those reasons too, right? So in my chapter on the comics of Julie Doucette, like her comics are full of nudity and ejaculations and menstruation and all these bodily functions that we're not really used to seeing in any kind of visual medium. Drawings of cutting off penises of men and drawing with like the bloody stump on the wall. It's very explicit and it's very direct, and there's just something that you can really get away with that in comics without it seeming exploitative or without it seeming. She does a good job of infusing that kind of thing with a joy and a humor, and that turns it into like a celebration of the body in some ways also. Whereas Gleckner, of course, is, that's far from a celebration, but it's also direct, unflinching.
Well, and as a scholar of comics, maybe you can take us through a little bit about how you might analyze this. So let's say you're reading one of these books, one of these comics autobiographies, perhaps. What do you do when you're reading that as a scholar that might be different than somebody reading a written autobiography? There are general ways, like I imagine, you think about the prose in one case, and in other cases you think about maybe formal criticism of the drawing or something. But yeah, I'm wondering if you could take a reader through, especially someone that might not be too experienced in comics. What do you do when you're thinking analytically as you're reading a comic, and how might that look different than if you were, say, reading an autobiography?
That's a really good question. I think maybe the sort of easiest way to answer that is also just to think about like how I teach comics. So I teach a lot of comics courses, and I often have students who, they've read comics, but they're not really comics readers, or, like everybody has read a comic at some point in their life, right? Even if it's just like a Garfield strip or something. But I have students who sort of, they don't really, or they claim to not really know, or sometimes they get confused by the layout, which image am I supposed to look at now, and that kind of thing. So there is definitely, I think, just like a basic literacy that you need to develop, and that you do develop when you read comics, right? You learn to pay attention to prose, to the images, to layout, to various sort of maybe echoes between images on different pages and those kinds of things. And it's something I notice depending on the institution that I've taught at. Currently, I'm in sort of like it's the Department of American Studies, but most of my students are a literature background. And so they tend to pay a lot of attention to narrative, to all sort of the conventions of literature that they've been taught since, high school and before. How do we analyze the short story, that kind of thing that everybody does in high school or in university. But I used to teach at an art school in Toronto, and my students there, they could not care less about the narrative. They were just interested in the images. They just wanted to talk about, how does this image communicate? What is the layout of it? What kind of art historical traditions does it fit into, and so on. So I think in that way, you really bring yourself to it. Whatever you're interested in a comic, whether it's the words or the images, you bring yourself to that, and you will probably focus on that. And it's something I've had to learn myself, because I come out of English departments, and I'm a literary scholar. So I had to teach myself, well, how is it that comics are different? And I think just the way I do it when I encounter a comic, and I'm just like, oh, there's something interesting going on, because you read it and it's so deceptively easy to read a comic, right? You're like, oh yeah, and then this happens, and oh yeah, I can see this person is doing that, and so on throughout the narrative. But you really have to, and this is something I tell my students too, you have to slow down. That's when you start to notice all kinds of interesting things. Why is it made this way? Why is the speech bubble there and in that shape? And, why does this character break the panel border in this way? Or, all these things that you might not really notice when you're just sort of reading it for the story or for pleasure or whatever. And, I force myself really to, maybe take even a few minutes per page and just really slow down. And then once I get into, sort of the full analysis, I'll spend hours and hours just looking at it. That comes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of all these different codes, all these different potential ways of expressing subjectivity that a comics page has, right? So, there's nothing on a comics page that is accidental, right? You also have to remember that if someone is drawing this, right, it takes a long time to draw something, and there's always a reason why things are drawn in the way they are, right? It's not just because that was an unthinking way that came into the world. So one assignment that I like to do with my students also, in order to force them to do this, is I call it the visual analysis project, where they take a piece of tracing paper, put it on top of a page, and then they have to trace the page and in their own hand. And by doing that, it really forces them to slow down, and it really forces them to pay attention to, well, why is this line, why does this line have this quality? Why does this thing happen in this way, and so on? And that's enormously helpful for my students, and their papers always improve a lot after that, because they learn to pay attention to form. And obviously people who study prose autobiography pay attention to form also, right? That's something we're trained to do as literary scholars. There's just an extra element of form, right? There's an extra literacy that you should have to develop for reading comics, the visual literacy. And I think it's something that, in a visual culture, we've got memes and Instagram posts and, visuality is everywhere for us. And so we are good at that. But the trick is to then combine that literacy with the verbal literacy that we have, and figure out how those things combine. And of course, there's a whole world of, formalist comic scholarship that theorizes how all of this works, and how, what does it mean if, the panels are like this or that, or what do different drawing styles mean, and what is the use of color, and all these things, all of that exists. And it's something that I make an effort to always include in my own scholarship, because I feel like, why study comics if you're only going to be reading it for the narrative, right? And something that I see, I think, in too much comic scholarship, if I'm completely honest, is that people they sort of forget that they're dealing with a comic, and they're just like, it's a narrative, right? And it is a narrative, but there's also that narrative represented in a very specific way in words and images. And if you don't pay any attention to that, I feel like you're sort of you're missing the point a little bit, right? You're not really doing, I guess, your job as a scholar of comics if you don't include that formal analysis.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. It reminds me of just something I've noticed, I think, is the way you can tell sort of dabblers in whatever comic studies, film studies, is that they tend to just talk about the plot or talk about the narrative, whereas people who are into, say, video games or comics or what have you, there's extra elements that other people don't seem to see.
This is something that I definitely noticed in film studies too, right?
Yeah.
And especially sort of when film studies get, I guess, people teach literature, and then they also include a film, right? And they don't don't really do anything to make the discussion about the filmic qualities, right?
Yeah, it makes me think of something that you said that I've heard a lot, and I'm going to ask you about it as a representative, but don't feel pressure. It's just that you said, you read some comics growing up, stopped for a while, I suppose got more serious perhaps, and then went back to comics. I mean, that's something I did myself. I read Batman and Robin and stuff like that, but then only during my PhD did I go back and sort of to relax after reading a lot of theory. I would read popular comics and got back into it. And then as I became a professor, I actually went more into comics. And I think that for a lot of people, it seems like you grow up reading comics or, randomly, not in any organized way. You stop that for a while and you get serious. But then a lot of people seem to go back to comics. I was wondering if you could, I don't know, say maybe more about your experience perhaps, but why you think this is so common. Or at least it seems to me to be so common in the people I talk to.
Yeah, I think there are a few things. So I noticed you use the word, like people get more serious. So they start reading other things, or they start reading like more serious comics.
Yeah, in scare quotes that nobody can see, but yeah.
Yeah, that's the traditional idea, right? Is that like comics are not really serious, but also that there are different kinds of comics, and some of them are serious and some of them are not, right? So there is definitely a bit of, I guess, like a schism in comic studies, even between people who work on sort of more, I don't know, mainstreamy superhero stuff, and people who work on I don't know, indie alternative comics, right? And there's also overlap, but there's definitely, I think, two different streams in the scholarship a bit, right? And I think a lot of people, especially in North America, they grew up reading the superhero comics. If you grew up reading that, you have a connection to it that I think I just don't have. And for me, I've read a lot of the central superhero comics, but I will never have that same kind of connection to that material, I think, because I haven't grown up with it, right? I think that you sort of have to have a little bit of that like nostalgic relationship with it in order to really appreciate a lot of that material. The same way that, I could go on for hours about the genius of Asterix and it might look really silly and it doesn't look nearly as like serious as like a Frank Miller Batman comic or anything, right? Like, but for me, that is like the nostalgic pleasure of that has also helps inform my relationship with comics today. So I don't know what it is that, I mean, as scholars, right, we're looking to work on and write about work that we enjoy, right? And so I think a lot of the time also if you enjoy comics, like, and especially maybe in the last 20 years, it's been possible to write and publish on comics, and comics studies is a field that is rapidly developing, right? And more book series and journals and publishers are taking chances on comic scholarship in ways that they weren't even 10 years ago. So there is just there's an opportunity to work on something that you like and that even if you're, of course, like, bringing your critical apparatus to it, like you still kind of need to like the work that you're working on in some fundamental way, right? But it's also, I think it's attractive because it's such an understudied form, right? There's just like so many comics. There's barely any scholarship on, I don't know, 99% of it, right? So you really have an opportunity to work on stuff that is not overstudied. And I always think of people I know who work on Shakespeare or Jane Austen or things like that. And I always think about like that, like the work of like just like situating yourself in the scholarship and just reading, all of it and just sort of carving out that little niche of like, well, no one has said anything about this one particular thing in this particular Shakespeare play or whatever, right? So I'm going to say something about that. And I think in contrast to that, like comics it's a wide open field, right? You can sort of pick just about anything and there would be almost no scholarship on it.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of the attraction, at least for me also, is just that I feel like I can go out there and, I can have a certain freedom to work on material that is understudied and that I think is also, I think that, there's a value in that. Like, there's a lot of culture out there. And we the idea that we're all sitting around studying the same small canon of text, it's almost depressing, right? It's like there's a whole wide world out there of things. Yeah, I don't know if that really answers your question, but I feel like that's definitely the attraction for me. And so I recently finished an article on the representation of racial whiteness in comics. And there's just no one has written about that. And it just seems like such almost like an obvious idea, right? Like whiteness studies has sort of boomed in the last 10 or 20 years, and comics tend to, be published on paper that is white. And so there's some clear sort of interesting ideas that come out of that, but they're just, I could barely find any scholarship on it. Maybe like a couple of articles that mentioned it in passing or that kind of thing. So in comic studies, you really get to sort of, write that, like, fingers crossed, foundational article on something, but it's fun because you get to have new ideas all the time.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It reminds me, I was at a music conference, a while ago, right around the time that Michael Jackson died, and someone was giving the keynote and mentioned that nobody has really written about Michael Jackson, which seems crazy, but is pretty much true in a scholarly sense, because it seemed like, I don't know, just not something to study, or one of the most popular musicians ever. There's probably millions of dissertations and articles on Beethoven, Mozart, and so on. But for some reason, one of the most popular artists had not had very much scholarship. Well, I think that has changed. I mean, I'm not following it particularly, but it's interesting that we think in academia a lot of the time there's nothing left to write that's new. But then you realize that there's some really great stuff, like you said, available. And I think you've started to answer my next question, but I'm still going to ask it. How did you arrive at these particular books? I mean, it's interesting, as you say, a lot of comic studies have taken on what I now see as autobiographies or biographies in some sense, like Mouse, as you said, Fun Home, Persepolis, like these are really big books in terms of popularity, but you didn't really go with those. I mean, you mentioned them, but you could have easily done those. Instead, you chose these, which are a lot more indie. How did you choose these and why? And maybe, sorry, before you even say that, maybe you could just say the ones that we've started to talk about it, but I don't think we've mentioned all of them yet.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So the book has 5 chapters, and the artists I discuss, one artist per chapter. In the first chapter, it's Julie Doucette. Second chapter, it's Phoebe Gleckner. In the third chapter, it's Ariel Srag. Chapter 4, it's Al Davison. And in the 5th chapter, it's Tufik El Rassi. So that's a really good question. I'm happy you're asking that. Because there is a tendency in comic studies, even though it's a small field, to sort of consolidate around, especially like in studies of autobiographical comics, right? Then you tend to consolidate around Mouse or Fun Home or Persepolis by Michel Satrapi. And so when I first, and I said this in the beginning of our talk here, when I first sort of got back into comics, like those were the books that got me interested in it. And I originally thought that I would write about those books, because at that point, Fun Home had just come out, Persepolis had just come out. These were new and sort of exciting books at that time. But then very quickly, sort of the scholarship consolidated around a few titles, right? So it's really like the Trinity is really Art Spiegelman's Mouse, Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, and Marchand Satrapi's Persepolis, right? And those are by a large margin, the most studied autobiographical comics. There are dozens of articles on each of those comics. So I originally thought that I would do that, but then after a little bit of sort of even just like initial research, or like a time passed as I was doing the research, and I just sort of realized I don't really want to do this. There is so much work out there, and it's much more fun, but it's also, I think that there are artists that are equally worthy of sort of being made subject to this kind of scholarship, right? Or that have equally important things to say about their lives. I mean, there wasn't really like a very sort of coherent, organizing principle behind selecting these books. By and large, they're books that I really like. They're books that I really appreciate. They're artists that I connect with in some way. And especially, I would say, chapter 1 on Julie Doucette. She's really, her comics are perhaps the reason that this whole book exists. Like when I first read her comics, it was sort of this formative experience of oh, holy crap, I didn't know that comics could do that. This is so interesting. This is so wild, so playful, so just, out there in some ways. And that really started me off. And then obviously, because I knew that I wanted to have a book that was organized thematically, chapters discuss in order issues of gender, gender, trauma, sexuality, disability, and race and ethnicity. And so I needed to find books that spoke to those issues. So in some ways, they're the books that I happened to know about or encountered that I think addressed those issues in the most scholarly interesting way, right? The comic that I felt like I had the most to say about.
Did you end up talking to any of these people?
A few of them. There's an interesting thing that's happening in comics studies where a lot of the people working on comics academically also often know the artist and often are sort of friends with certain artists. And that has to do, I think, with a couple of things. And one of them is, people are coming out of often sort of like fan backgrounds in a way, right? There's a sort of an interest in these, if you're studying like a literary novel, like you might not be particularly interested in the author. You're more interested perhaps in the novel, or I would say like traditional prose literature doesn't quite have the same background, or like this is not this sort of like background in like a fanish engagement with the material, right? That you see in with comics. So I think there's that. There's a long tradition of inviting artists to come and speak at comics conferences. So people have opportunities to meet in that way. And also I think that there's an interest on the part of many artists to engage with the scholarship, because a lot of these artists, they're aware that they're working in a form that is critically less valued than traditional prose, right? So there's a legitimatizing sort of move in having people write about your work scholarly, right? In a scholarly way. So I think artists they're open to those kinds of relationships. So that being said, I don't really, I've met 3 of these authors briefly. I've been in email contact with a few of them now and then, but nothing really sort of very, like I interviewed Julie Doucette for a website once and a few things like that, but nothing, like I don't really, well, again, maybe the exception is Julie Doucette, who I've met several times. I used to live in Montreal, and she's based in Montreal, and she would attend the city's zine fair, Expo Zine, and she would just sit there, tabling like anyone else, and sell her prints for like $5 or whatever it was, and so my house is full of her prints that I would go there and buy every year, and so like again, that's sort of my own like fanish attachment to her work, maybe that set me on the course of even writing this book. But there are definitely other scholars who sort of they conduct like long interviews with artists whose work they write about, and really sort of like almost sometimes will insert sections in their scholarship about like how they sort of have developed this relationship with this artist and what that tells them about their working habits and so on, and then sort of subject that to critical analysis also.
Yeah, I mean, I ask because you're doing autobiography studies, and so I think on one level, for me at least, the journalist in me would want to immediately talk to these people and find out what connections they have to the actual work, or maybe some more authentic truth to what's behind it. But then this sort of more traditional scholar in me would say like, no, you should address the text, and what these people say about their text might be interesting, but it also might be divergent or, I don't know, take away from the actual analysis of the text. So there's that. But then, as you said, also in comic studies, there's much more, I think, acceptance and accessibility of fans, and that can go either way. I mean, there's some great sort of fan studies work, people doing things that clearly they're fans of, but also very smart and critical work. And then sometimes, I don't know, at least among my friends and I, we roll our eyes when we hear like ACA fans. Not always, of course, but oftentimes it can mean like someone who just really likes stuff and is trying to write about it. But how do you weigh like how much you engage or think about the author when you're doing this kind of work?
Clearly, it's sort of impossible to, when you're working on autobiography, to like not, I mean, maybe it's not impossible, but, I think it's a natural thing to sort of wonder about the real life author, right? Like you can't really write about it, I think, without like inferring something or touching upon some of that relationship between the author and the work of art, right? You have to kind of engage with that question of, why does this work of art exist? Why does the artist, the author create it in this way? What are they trying to say, all like about themselves often, right? Like that's the ultimate goal of autobiography is like self-expression, right? So it's natural to wonder about that self, I think, and to sort of try to make some connections about what kind of intellectual work is it doing for the artist, right? Like, what is the purpose of this? And for someone like Phoebe Glegner, I write about how it seems to me that she's using comics. She's using this form to work through her trauma of being sexually abused when she was a child, right? And it seems very obvious to me, in light of my analysis, that that is the purpose of these comics, right? It is sort of like there's an aspect of self, therapy or something like that, right? That's going on. Or maybe even catharsis or any other kind of sort of theoretical term you want to use along those lines. But then the artists will often sort of flat out deny that, right? So Glegner in interviews has said, well, I don't think this is cathartic at all. And I note that in my writing of it, but I don't think that it necessarily invalidates my analysis of it. And I think that someone like Glegner is also, he's being deliberately sort of playful or vague about what she has numerous interviews where she talks about, well, this is not even autobiography. You can never represent anything. Everything is nothing is the truth. Everything is just a representation. You're not reading what I experienced by reading this. You're reading like my, representation of it, and fundamentally different. So there is no such thing as autobiography. And I get that point, but I still think that I can, I guess, write about her work as autobiography and as something that is, when she very clearly is drawing herself and talking about her own experiences, right? So I don't know. I don't think that there's a fundamental conflict in doing that, but I think part of the attraction for me is also that it is based on reality, right? It is something that is very, that rings true, right? And so in the high school comics of Ariel Sprague, like that's almost the opposite extreme of that. This is true. She's just so insistent that this is the truth, right? And as she said, she has this folder labeled the truth, and she's very obsessed with telling the exact truth of what is happening, right? Even though, of course, it is a representation, right? But that's one of the things that I think is an interesting tension in comics, because it is sort of self-evidently not the truth. If you're reading a prose autobiography, you can kind of imagine it to be the truth because it is abstracted into language. But in comics, it's both sort of more the truth because it's images of something, but it's also very clearly just a representation of it, right? I don't know if that makes sense, but there's just something that happens in comics where it becomes more real and less real at the same time. And I think that tension is really interesting to explore. And I think a lot of these artists will sort of push in one direction sometime and another direction other times, depending on the scene or the material that's being presented, right?
Yeah.
In prose autobiography, it really just sort of, everything just seems kind of true, right? Because it is just abstracted into language, and it's very easy to imagine. Your own imagination of it becomes the truth in a way, right? There is no visual representation to counteract your own representation.
I mean, it does make me think of Mouse, where, you're seeing cats and mice, but it feels very viscerally real, which on one level seems very counterintuitive. But I mean, anyone who's read Mouse, I'm sure would hopefully agree that it's, even though you're seeing cartoons of animals, you're also really disturbed by our history.
Yeah. I mean, one of the weird things about that book is that you forget that it's such a fundamental metaphor in that book, right? But you just completely forget it at by page 2 or something, right? And you're just do you just accept these characters? And there's something, I'm still struggling. Why is that? What is it with? Are we better able to project ourselves into these characters because they're not, they're self-evidently not real in a way. Not that any comics page is real in that sense. But there's just something about that really is fascinating about that book, and I haven't quite worked out why it is that we accept it so readily when it's not just like a Tom and Jerry cartoon of it's not fantasy in that way. It's so reality based, and yet we completely just accept this absurd scenario of the characters are cats and mice, right? Yeah.
But I mean, that brings us to the idea of what you're studying in comic studies, is that there's so many interesting facets that you could, easily build a career looking at this in various ways, which makes me ask, where do you want to go with this? Are you going to continue in a similar vein to your book, Serial Selves, or are you going in a different direction? Maybe you could say a little bit about what you're up to. Maybe give us a sort of brief autobiographical sketch of you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been very fortunate to study comics professionally, right? So most of my teaching is on comics. Almost all of my research at this point is on comics. That's actually not a very common thing, even though comic studies is sort of growing quickly. There are almost I think, in the history of the world, there have been 3 jobs in comic studies, that have been like advertised as comic studies. And mine is not even one of them, but I have a very supportive department who really likes my work, wants to see me continue that, to the point where I'm launching a master's program in comic studies in September 2020, which will be the second master's program in comic studies in the world, that I'll be the director of at the University of East Anglia in Norwich in England. That is a rare opportunity to do something like that, and it's definitely allowing me to sort of double down on the comicsness of my career. I'd say that most of my colleagues in comic studies, they're hired to maybe do something else, right? They're hired to teach, some other literary genre or period or something like that. And then they also just like bring comics in as maybe like a side thing that they do, or they manage to somehow like make comics part of their main thing. But to be able to have it as almost the entire content of my job is really, really exciting. So I'm absolutely planning on continuing that. I'm currently working on sort of figuring out like what the next project is, and I think it's going to be some sort of a continuation of this, but not or at least in this book's engagement with the representation of finalization in comics. So I'm interested especially in the depiction of race and in sort of the history of race in comics, and of how comics have also contributed to the construction of, I would say, various racist and otherwise exclusionary visual codes in the culture, right? A lot of those racist stereotypes that we recognize, they developed or they were supported by comics very early on, and they live on in comics often, right? So there's something really interesting that's happening in terms of how this like simplified visual language of comics comes very close to stereotype and caricature, right? They're similar methods or modes of representing human beings. So you accentuate certain traits when you create a stereotype, and you do the same thing when you draw a comics character, right? So there's like this weird slippage between these different modes, and I'm interested in exploring that. So I think that's the next project that I'm sort of currently trying to figure out, is that, what form that will take, whether that will be a book or a series of articles or perhaps both.
Yeah, no, that would be important work. I'd love to see. And maybe Google will get your name right this time. Yeah. Well, before we started recording, you were telling me that it's funny that Google seems to have taken off a letter from your name. And as we were talking about the autobiographical I, just agree. We all agree that means, this is who we are. It's funny that you were stripped of a letter. Could you maybe just say a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I'm originally from Denmark and have a funny, I also got a funny letter in my last name. So I have an O with a slash through it. And it's just a letter that, it doesn't really exist outside of Scandinavia. And most, I guess, especially sort of internet-based or any kind of digital forums or anything, don't really know what to do with it. So whenever it gets put into some form somewhere, it always comes out at the other end just a garbled mess of random characters, or it just gets completely taken out of it. When my publisher sent the book's metadata to all the databases or whatever, and it appeared in Google Books, they just cut out a letter from my last name. And you would think that Google, of all companies, have a way of dealing with unusual letters, right? They see a lot of information, but they didn't, so they just cut it out, and I had to contact Google, and just contacting Google wasn't ideal, but finally they got it right, and maybe there's some interesting overlap about I'm insisting on representation here in a way of no, I want to be seen in this way. But it's just funny because it doesn't really feel like my name if it doesn't have the slash through the O there. So for some reason I tend to insist on it, even though I probably should just let it go.
No, man, like I said, I think it's very cool. I wish I had a slash in my name. Yeah, the last name that you would want is Chris Richardson, because if you Google that, you'll find hundreds, thousands probably of people.
Yeah.
Well,
at least I am definitely eminently Googleable. If you
If you can type the letter.
If you can type, well, I think Google knows how to do it. Even like you can just type it with just an O and it still finds me. So Google does know, but they just selectively know, I think.
But no, that's cool. And, well, I've taken up a lot of your time, Frederik, but I really appreciate you talking to me.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah, the Serial Selves, Identity and Representation in Autobiographical Comics. It's a very cool read and interesting in bringing up a lot of the things that we've talked about if anyone wants to go further into these. So yeah, again, thank you so much for your time and talking to me about your work.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you again for listening to and supporting This Is Not a Pipe podcast. If you're so inclined, please leave some reviews, tell some friends about this, and don't forget to check out tinapp.org to see Frederik's recommended readings. A lot of interesting stuff available from authors about what they're reading, what they recommend. Definitely worth checking out. Until next time, I'm Chris Richardson. Cheers.